The story of Anri and Horus does not begin on the road of sacrifices where you first meet them. It begins years earlier, in a place of worship that had turned into a slaughterhouse. The Cathedral of the Deep was originally a site for the Way of White, a holy ground where deacons and priests tended to the flame and guided the souls of the faithful. But the fire was fading, and the men inside the cathedral grew desperate. Their leader was a man named Aldrich. He was a cleric who had found a different kind of strength, one that did not come from the gods or the light. He began to eat people. He started with the weak and the forgotten, but his hunger grew until it was no longer a habit, but a requirement. He ate so many human beings that his body literally dissolved. He became a mass of sludge and bone, a bloated, soft thing that looked like a drowned animal. He was not a man anymore, but he was powerful. Because of that power, the world chose him to be a lord of cinder. The fire does not care about the screams of children. It only cares about the destiny of the soul that feeds it. Anri and Horus were among the children brought to that cathedral to be consumed. We do not know exactly how they managed to crawl out of that pit of rot, while their friends were being chewed into nothing. But they did. They escaped the clutches of a monster that the rest of the world called a saint. That escape defined every choice they made afterward. They were not heroes seeking glory. They were two traumatized survivors who had made a pact to return to the nightmare and kill the thing that lived there. By the time you meet them, they are both undead. Anri is unkindled, a specific type of undead who tried and failed to link the fire in a previous age. Horus is her companion, a man who wears the rusted heavy armor of an executioner. There is a deep irony in his choice of clothing. He killed a corrupt executioner and took the man's armor, turning a suit made for killing into a shield for the innocent. He became a blue sentinel, a knight who exists only to protect others from the fingers of Rosaria, the red phantoms who hunt for human tongues. When you first meet them, standing by the halfway fortress, the dynamic is clear. Anri is the talkative leader, the one who handles the social weight of their mission. She speaks of her duty with a forced politeness that hides a deep, vibrating fear. She mentions the children they knew, asking for a blessing on their souls. She is carrying the weight of an entire generation of dead children on her shoulders. Beside her, Horus says nothing. He grunts and huffs, his voice likely ruined by his time in the cathedral or the violence of his life afterward. Anri defends him, calling him a kind-hearted knight and an upstanding partner. She needs him to be those things because, without Horus, she is just a girl with a dull sword. Horus is her anchor. He is the physical proof that she survived the impossible once before. Together, they believe they can do it again. Their first destination is the Cathedral of the Deep. They return to the place of their trauma, ready to face the man-eater. But when they arrive, they find a final nothing. The massive coffin where Aldrich was supposed to be resting is empty. The monster had already risen and left for his true home in Irithyll. Inside the empty grave, they find only a small doll. This doll is a key, a magical bypass that allows entry into the frozen city of Irithyll. For Anri and Horus, this is a crushing blow. They had braced themselves for a final confrontation, only to find that their enemy had moved the goalposts. They are forced to travel deeper into the world, through the swamps of Farron, and the tunnels of Karthus, chasing a shadow that refuses to be caught. The catacombs of Karthus are where the silence of their partnership turns into a tragedy. The tunnels are filled with the bones of ancient warriors and traps designed to kill anyone who enters. In the chaos of this darkness, Anri and Horus are separated. Anri is frantic when you find her. She is snared by the uncertainty of her situation, terrified that she will have to face Aldrich alone. She asks if you've seen her companion, her voice cracking, the realization that her anchor is gone. She leaves prism stones on the ground, glowing bits of glass that she hopes will guide Horus back to her. But Horus did not get lost. He fell. He ended up at the bottom of a massive chasm. In the smoldering lake, this place is a graveyard of the old chaos, filled with the ruins of a demon civilization that has long since died. In the damp, hot silence of that lake, Horus lost his mind. Hollowing is not a sudden event. It is a result of losing your want. For Horus, his want was to protect Anri and fulfill their duty. Perhaps that fall broke his body, or perhaps the isolation of the lake finally allowed the horror of his childhood to catch up with him. When you find him in the edge of the smoldering lake, he's no longer the upstanding knight Anri described. He's a hollow. He attacks with a mindless fury. He doesn't recognize the blue sentinel badge he wears or the mission he swore to complete. He's just a shell in a rusted suit of armor. If you kill Horus and tell Anri where he died, she travels down to the lake. This is the moment where Anri's story branches. If she finds Horus's grave, her resolve is hardened by grief. She moves on to Irithyll, sitting in the church of Yoshka, staring into a fire that provides no warmth. She tells you that her duty must be done, even alone. She mentions the children again, and that she's no longer fighting for a future. She's fighting to justify the past. She's a girl who has lost her only friend, and is now standing at the gates of a city ruled by the man who ate her family. In the church of Yoshka, a shadow is watching her. A pilgrim from the land of Londo is hiding in the corner, disguised as a statue. This pilgrim is waiting for the ripe time to take Anri. If you do not intervene, Anri is kidnapped and taken to the secret tomb of the gods in Anor Londo. There, she's not killed in battle, but sacrificed in a wedding ceremony. To the people of Londo, hollowing is not a curse to be cured, but a power to be embraced. They want you, the Ashen One, to become the Lord of Hollows, and for that, you need a spouse. Anri is chosen because she is a powerful and high soul undead. The wedding involves driving a sword of Avawal through her face, stealing her dark sigils to add to your own. In this ending, Anri's purpose is completely erased by yours. She becomes a tool for a new age, her dreams of avenging the children forgotten so you can sit on a throne of ash. However, if you kill the assassin in the church, Anri survives. She makes it to the gates of Anor Londo, the ancient city of the gods. Anri leaves a summon sign, asking for your help. This is a role reversal. For the entire game, NPCs help the player, but now, Anri is the one asking you to enter her world. Together, you step into the cathedral where the gods once lived. You find Aldrich, but he is not the sludge you expected. He has consumed the body of Gwyndolin, the last god of the city. He's using the god's torso like a puppet, firing magical arrows and swinging a spear tipped with the souls of the dead. The fight is desperate. Anri fights with a straight sword that looks dull and chipped, but she swings it with the strength of someone who has waited an entire lifetime for this moment. When Aldrich finally falls, the victory feels hollow. The monster is dead, but the children are still gone, and Horus is still dead. Anri stands in the middle of the cathedral and breathes for the first time in her life without the weight of Aldrich over her. She says thank you, truly and deeply, and tells Horus that they did it. But once the monster is dead, Anri has no reason to stay sane. The undead curse is fueled by purpose. Once a mission is finished, the mind begins to leak out of the dark sign. Anri knows this. She asks you not to follow her. She retreats to one of two places. If she knows where Horus died, she goes back to the smoldering lake to sit by his grave. If she doesn't, she goes back to the Cathedral of the Deep, to the hill overlooking the place where she was once a prisoner. When you find her, she is completely hollowed. She attacks you with a broken sword, her movements jerky and mindless. She has forgotten the mission. She has forgotten the children. And she has forgotten you. She's just another shadow in a world of shadows. The tragedy of Anri and Horus is that they did everything right. They were loyal. They were brave. And they fulfilled their oaths. In any other story, they would be the heroes who saved the world. But in this world, there is no reward for being good. There is only the long, slow fade into the dark. They escaped the man-eater only to be consumed by the very air they breathed. They are a reminder that hollowing isn't just about losing your memory. It's about what happens when you finally finish the one thing you were born to do. When the mission is over, there is nothing left but silence. The young sorcerer, Sulyvahn, was born in a world of cold and rot. But unlike those around him, he had lost nothing. The painted world of Ariandel is a sanctuary for the broken and the forlorn, a place that pulls in those who have reached the end of their tether in the outside world. It is a home built on the comfort of shared despair, where the inhabitants find a strange peace in the slow decay of their surroundings. Sulyvahn grew up in this silence, yet he was fundamentally different from the painting's residents. He possessed a sharp, cold intellect and a talent for sorcery that outstriped anyone in his home. Because he had not experienced the loss that brought others to Ariandel, he remained an outsider in the only world he knew. This lack of belonging sparked an envy that would eventually grow into a terrifying singular ambition. He left the painting as a young man, carrying with him the frost sorceries he had mastered, and he never looked back. He wandered far below the moonlit spires of Irithyll, past the dungeon cells and into the lightless depths of the world. There, he discovered the ruins of the profaned capital. This was a kingdom that had once been proud, the only human nation ever to be ruled by a giant. But the giants and the humans were gone, leaving behind only the gold and a singular terrifying anomaly known as the profaned flame. This fire was a direct violation of the laws of the universe. It did not fade. It did not need wood or souls to keep it burning, and it held within it the corruptive influence of the abyss. It was a cold flame, one that offered immense power but demanded the corruption of the heart in return. When Sulyvahn looked into that unfading fire, his ambition took root. He was no longer just a talented sorcerer from a painted world. He was a man who had found the ultimate lever to move the world. He left the capital carrying two things: a great sword, forged for his new purpose, and a heart that had been permanently changed by the fire. Sulyvahn arrived in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, a city that sat beneath the shadow of Anor Londo. At this time, the city of the gods was still ruled by the remnants of the old royalty: Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun, and the Son of Gwyn, led the Dark Moon Knights from the great cathedral. Alongside him was his half-sister, the crossbreed Yorshka. The city was a monument to stability, a place that had remained largely unchanged throughout countless cycles of the fire. Sulyvahn did not attack this establishment with a traditional army. Instead, he chose the path of infiltration. He used his immense talent for sorcery to earn a place amongst the Dark Moon Knights. To the world, he appeared to be a devoted servant of the moon. He was even granted the Great Sword of Judgment, a ceremonial blade that symbolized his authority to act as a judge for the royalty. However, the power within that sword was not drawn from faith or the moon, but from the very sorceries that the old gods despised. Sulyvahn was a snake in the garden, waiting for the right moment to strike. The coup began not with a battle, but with a sickness. Gwyndolin, the god who protected the city, suddenly fell ill. While the public records do not explicitly state the cause, it is widely understood that Sulyvahn or his followers used poison or dark influence to weaken the deity. With the leader of the city incapacitated, Sulyvahn made his move. He wrongfully proclaimed himself pontiff, the highest religious and political authority in the land. He imprisoned Gwyndolin in the old cathedral and locked Yorshka away in a high tower. By holding the leaders captive, he paralyzed the Silver Knights and the Dark Moon Order. They could not fight back for fear that their gods would be executed. Sulyvahn had taken an entire kingdom without a single drop of blood being spilled on the battlefield. Once his political control was absolute, Sulyvahn began the systematic corruption of the church. The Way of White, a religious order dedicated to the linking of the fire, was twisted from within. Archdeacon MacDonald, a high-ranking member of the clergy, began to collaborate with the new pontiff. Together, they shared the focus of their worship away from the light and toward the deep. The deep was a place of stagnation and dark water, a version of the soul that had become heavy and foul. MacDonald began to teach stories derived from these stagnating souls, turning religious catalysts into tools for dark magic. This corruption spread through the clergy like a plague, eventually reaching the Cathedral of the Deep, where Archdeacon Royce and his followers abandoned their oaths to the fire. The holy men who were supposed to protect the Age of Fire were now actively working to usher in an age of darkness and rot. Sulyvahn's rule was defined by a series of horrific biological experiments. He viewed humanity and life itself as raw materials to be shaped. In the Irithyll dungeon, he attempted to transform human beings into dragons, seeking the immortality of the ancient stone-scaled beasts. These experiments were largely failures, resulting in the wretches, which are pale, distorted creatures with human faces and stunted tailbones, that spend their lives weeping in the dark. He also turned his attention to the residents of Irithyll, enslaving the population and transforming many into monstrous beasts. The spider women who haunt the sewers and the rib-cage beasts that roam the streets are the remnants of his cruelty. He forced out the latent beasthood within men, believing that the more feral a creature was, the more useful it would be as a weapon. The most elite of Sulyvahn's weapons were the Boreal Outrider Knights. These were high-ranking warriors who were sent away on foreign campaigns to act as the Pontiff's eyes in distant lands. Before they left, Sulyvahn granted them special eye rings, which are the Pontiff's left eye and right eye. These rings were designed to turn the wearer into a mindless beast of war. As the knights fought, the rings would heal their wounds and boost their strength, but they would also slowly erode their sanity. Eventually, the knights would lose their human forms entirely, their armor fusing with their own skin as they devolved into frantic, long-limbed predators. Vort of the Boreal Valley was one such knight, but his companion, the Dancer, was a more tragic case. The Dancer was a direct descendant of the old royalty, likely a daughter of Guinevere. She was one of the few who had been left behind when their family fled to Lothric. Sulyvahn captured her and, in an act of petty humiliation, forced her to serve as a dancer in his court. When he grew bored of her performance, he made her an Outrider Knight and gave her the eye rings that would destroy her mind. She became a towering, enchanting beast of death, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that still echoed her royal heritage. Sulyvahn sent both Vort and the Dancer to the kingdom of Lothric. They were not sent to help his allies, but to guard the gates of the castle and watch the royal family. Sulyvahn knew that the fire was fading and that the Lords of Cinder would eventually be raised. He wanted his eyes in place, so that when the world collapsed, he would be the one to control the pieces. While Sulyvahn maintained his grip on Irithyll, a greater threat arrived from the Cathedral of the Deep. Aldrich, a Lord of Cinder who had been raised from his grave, marched toward the Boreal Valley. Aldrich was a saint who had spent his life devouring men, and he had a singular goal: to devour a god. Sulyvahn realized that he could not defeat Aldrich in a direct conflict, or perhaps he saw a more profitable opportunity. He formed an unholy alliance with the Man-Eater. Sulyvahn opened the gates of Anor Londo and handed over the weakened Gwyndolin to the monster. Aldrich began the long, agonizing process of eating the Dark Sun alive. Sulyvahn remained in the cathedral, watching as the old order was consumed. He had successfully replaced the gods with a Lord of Cinder, who shared his vision of an age of deep seas. By the time the Ashen One reaches Irithyll, Sulyvahn is a shell of his former self. He wears the torn ceremonial robes of his office, his face hidden behind roots-like growths. He stands in the center of his cathedral, wielding the profaned greatsword and the greatsword of judgment. He is a man who mastered every art: frost sorcery, moon miracles, and the profaned flame to reach the top of the world. He manipulated kings, corrupted priests, and turned princesses into beasts. Yet, despite all his brilliance and cruelty, he remains a prisoner of the cycle he tried to subvert. The tragedy of Sulyvahn is that he achieved everything he ever wanted. He left a world where he didn't belong and built a kingdom where everyone was forced to belong to him. He erased the old gods and replaced them with his own image, but in the end, he was undone by a simple, unkindled undead. His story proves that even the most calculated ambition cannot withstand the weight of the fading fire. He tore apart every bond he ever had to gain power, only to realize that power means nothing when the world itself is disappearing. He was a man with nothing to lose, and in the end, he lost exactly that. The history of giants in the world of Dark Souls is a chronicle of labor, exploitation, and quiet suffering. In the age of the gods, they were the silent pillars of Anor Londo, used as sentinels or basic laborers because the gods viewed their simple minds as fit for little else. Even those who rose to greatness were not spared from human cruelty. Hawkeye Goff, a legendary archer and a knight of Gwyn, was tricked into believing he was blind when former humans packed his helmet with tree resin. He accepted his fate with a grace that his tormentors did not deserve. In other lands like Dragon Lake, giants were hunted for their souls or experimented upon until their very essence was displaced. By the time the world converged at Lothric, the giants had been reduced to slaves, wallowing in the filth of cathedrals or wandering the battlements as mindless beasts. Amidst this long history of degradation, only one giant truly broke the mold of his race. His name was Yhorm, and he was a king who ruled over men. Yhorm was born into a legacy that commanded both fear and hatred. He was the descendant of an ancient conqueror, a figure whose sheer skill and power had once forced the people of the profaned capital into submission. While history is murky, the skeletal remains and massive proportions suggest he may have shared blood with High Lord Wolnir, the tyrant of Karthus, who ground the crowns of the 1,000 kings into the dirt. When that lineage of conquest eventually collapsed or fell to the abyss, the people of the capital found themselves in a terrifying position. They were a civilization without a leader, vulnerable to the encroaching shadows. In a move born of desperation rather than affection, they approached Yhorm. They asked the descendant of the oppressor to become their protector. And with that, Yhorm accepted his burden, stepping into the role of a lord for a people who secretly loathed his very existence. He became their weighty blade and their stone-hard shield, standing at the front lines of every conflict to ensure the city remained safe. However, the crown Yhorm wore was a heavy, bitter thing. The people called him Lord, but their respect was a thin veil for their deep-seated prejudice. They viewed him as a dullard, a simpleton, whose only value was his capacity for violence. They were ashamed that they had to rely on a giant for their survival, and this shame manifested as a quiet, insincere loyalty. Yhorm was fully aware of the whispers in the halls and the distrust in the eyes of his subjects. To prove his sincerity and to show that he harbored no desire for tyranny, he performed an act of radical vulnerability. He possessed 2 legendary swords, known as Storm Rulers, weapons infused with the power of the storm and specifically designed to bring giants to their knees. He kept one and gave the other to the people who doubted him. It was a silent fact. If he ever failed his duty, or became the monster they feared he was, he had provided them with the means to kill him. The middle years of Yhorm's reign were defined by a shift from a defender to a man consumed by grief. During the many wars fought to preserve the capital, Yhorm lost someone he loved dearly. The records do not name this person, whether they were a friend, a companion, or a human he had grown to care for. But their death shattered Yhorm's spirit. Up until that moment, he had fought with a great shield, symbolizing his role as the protector of his people. After that loss, he threw the shield away. He no longer felt the need for self-preservation, and he no longer felt he could truly protect anything of value. To compensate for the loss of defense, he added a left-handed notch to his massive machete. This allowed him to use the weapon with a two-handed grip, enabling a berserker-like style that relied on raw, overwhelming aggression. He became a king who fought as if he were already dead, crushing his enemies with a cold fury that left nothing but broken steel and ash in its wake. While Yhorm fought external threats, the profaned capital was rotting from within. A group of women, relatives of an ancient oracle, triggered a curse that had been festering in their blood. They transformed into horrific monstrosities, monstrous hands with calcified skin and holes in their palms that hungered for golden flesh. These creatures became the caretakers of a new unnatural fire, the profaned flame. This was not the warm, sustaining light of the first flame, but a cold, abyssal fire that never went out. It was a fire that swallowed the hearts of those it touched, inspiring a new culture of cruelty and torture among the nobility of the capital. The flame was inextinguishable, a permanent stain on the world that Yhorm had sworn to protect. Seeing his city falling into this spiritual darkness, Yhorm made a final desperate decision. He decided to link the first flame, hoping that by becoming a Lord of Cinder, he could put the profaned flame to rest and finally prove his worth to his subjects. Before he departed for the kiln, Yhorm visited the only person who had ever shown him genuine friendship, Sigurd of Katarina. Sigurd was a bumbling, kind-hearted knight who saw the soul of the giant rather than the shadow of the conqueror. They shared a bond that transcended race and status. Yhorm gave his remaining storm ruler to Sigurd and made him promise that if Yhorm ever returned to life as a hollowed lord, Sigurd would be the one to fulfill the duty of a friend and end his suffering. With his final pact secured, Yhorm gave himself to the fire, but the linking of the flame by a giant produced a result that no one expected. When Yhorm's soul was offered to the first flame, a rush of fire fell from the sky and incinerated the profaned capital. The fire was selective and cruel. It consumed only human flesh. In a single moment, every citizen Yhorm had died to protect was turned into a melted corpse, their skin fused to the gold they had hoarded. Yhorm had sacrificed everything for his people, and the result was their total annihilation. Ages passed, and the fire inevitably began to fade once more. The bell tolled, and Yhorm was brought back from the grave to link the fire a second time. But when he rose, he did not return to the throne in Lothric. He looked at the world and saw that his first sacrifice had been a failure. His city was a graveyard of ash and melted gold. The profaned flame he had tried to quench was still burning, indifferent to his pain. Yhorm retreated to the ruins of his throne room and sat amongst the charred remains of his subjects. He was a lord who had realized that his entire life of service had been a joke played by the universe. He stayed there in silence, howling in despair, waiting for the end of the world. He had no intention of being kindled again. He had already given his soul, and it hadn't been enough to save a single person he cared about. The final chapter of Yhorm's story begins with the sound of heavy, clanking armor moving through the dark. Sigurd of Katarina, with the help of the Ashen One, finally reached the heart of the profaned capital. He had traveled through dungeons and swamps, facing his own fears to reach his old friend. When he stepped into the throne room, he did not see a king. He saw a broken comrade. He unsheathed the Storm Ruler and called out to Yhorm, reminding him of their promise. The battle was a tragic display of loyalty. Sigurd used the power of the storm to bring the giant to his knees, fulfilling the grim necessity of their pact. When Yhorm finally fell, Sigurd shared one last toast with the player, celebrating the valor of his friend one last time before his own journey ended. He had fulfilled his purpose, and in this world, once a purpose is finished, there is nothing left but to fade to black. Yhorm's tragedy is the ultimate example of a king who ruled a city over an undeserving population. A protector whose greatest act of protection resulted in a massacre, and a hero whose only reward was a second life of mourning. He spent his existence trying to overcome the prejudice of his subjects and the legacy of his father, only to realize that the cycle of fire cares nothing for effort or merit. In the end, his cinders are just another set of ashes to be placed on the throne, a small pile of dust that represents the total collapse of a civilization. The profaned capital remains a tomb, and the profaned flame continues to burn, waiting for the next heart to corrupt. Yhorm was a giant who tried to carry the world on his shoulders, but the world was simply also to be saved. The history of the world is usually written from the perspective of the lord who sat on golden thrones. But the true story of existence belongs to a man who was never intended to be more than a foot soldier. Slave Knight Gael was presented at the very beginning, when the first flames ignited and created the disparity of life and death. He stood in the shadow of the dragons as they fell, and he remained standing when the great cathedrals of the gods finally crumbled into the dust at the end of time. To look at Gael is to look at the oldest living memory of the human race. While the kings and gods we encountered on our journey sought to preserve their own power, Gael's journey was driven by a much humbler and far more exhausting purpose. His life was a long rhythmic cycle of sacrifice, fought in the service of a divine order that viewed his kind as nothing more than disposable fodder. The gods, led by Gwyn, harbored a deep and malevolent fear for the first men. They recognized that while their own power was tied to a sun that was destined to fade, the power of humanity was rooted in the dark of the abyss, which is a force that only grew stronger as the world grew colder. This fear led to the systematic suppression of human history. The Ringed Knights were the first victims of this betrayal. These were the earliest men, warriors of immense strength who fought alongside the Silver Knights in the war against the ancient dragons. They were not volunteers. They were commanded to serve. Despite their vital role in bringing down the stone-scaled predators, their names were never recorded in the annals of glory. The gods made sure that the contributions of these men were never praised. Their legacy was buried under the weight of time because the gods did not want anyone to remember that humanity was once capable of challenging the heavens. The betrayal of the Ringed Knights went deeper than just the lack of recognition. The gods intentionally sent them into battle with inferior equipment. While the Silver Knights were draped in armor designed to deflect dragonfire and carried weapons imbued with the power of lightning, the ringed knights were forced to rely on arms forged in the abyss. These spears and swords were made of a dark metal that betrayed a smidgen of life, suggesting the weapons themselves possessed a form of primitive sentience or memory. This terrified the gods so much that they cast a seal of fire upon the weapons and the men who held them. The seal was the dark sign. It was a ring of fire intended to cage the darkness within the human soul, ensuring that the power of the abyss would always be suppressed by the divine will of the sun. The ringed knights were effectively shackled to their own equipment, forever cursed by the very gods they fought to protect. In the shadow of these branded warriors stood the slave knights. Gael was a member of this order, a group of undead warriors who served the gods in perpetuity. Unlike the ringed knights, the slave knights were not initially branded with the dark sign on their gear. This armor was issued as a symbol of supposed honor, but the reality was a life of unending slaughter. They were used as fodder in the bleakest, most desperate battles of the old wars. As the centuries passed, their skin turned to charred leather. Their bones became twisted from the strain of combat, and their minds began to fray. Yet, they were never relieved of duty. A slave knight's service ended only when their body was physically unable to hold a blade. They would die, rise again, and return to the front lines, trapped in a loop of violence that lasted longer than most kingdoms. Gael's origins are obscured, but his equipment provides clues to his ancient nature. He wears a vibrant red hood, the standard uniform of the slave knights. He carries lightning bolts that are described as artifacts from an era when the pact between gods and humans were still upheld. This suggests that Gael may have been a pygmy of the earliest times, a man who saw the world when it was still young. He wielded an executioner's greatsword, a heavy chipped mass of iron used for beheadings. This blade was said to retain a keen memory of its duties. In the logic of this world, memory is a trait of the living. By carrying a weapon that remembered its kills, Gael was carrying the weight of every life he had ever taken in the name of the gods. He saw the cruelty of the divine order at its peak, and likely realized that there would never be a place for humanity in a world ruled by the sun. At some point in the long, slow decay of the world, Gael made a choice to find a purpose of his own. He abandoned his service to the gods and found his way to the painted world of Ariandel. This place was a sanctuary for the forlorn, those who had been rejected by the outside world and sought refuge in a home built on rot and cold. There, Gael met a young girl with no name, referred to only as the Painter. She was a child of painting, a girl who possessed the ability to create a new world through her art. Gael became a father figure to her, and through her, he discovered a mission that justified his long, painful existence. The girl needed to paint a new home for the forlorn, but she needed a specific pigment to make the painting last. She needed the blood of the dark soul. The current painted world was rotting. A woman named Freed, and unkindled like the player, had entered the painting and convinced its inhabitants to embrace the rot rather than the cleansing fire. She preferred the stagnant peace of a dying world to the pain of a new beginning. Gael knew that the painting had to be burned away so that the girl could create something new. He traveled to the outside world, carrying a small rotten scrap of the painting, seeking another unkindled who could bring the flame. This is where he encounters the player in the cleansing chapel. He begs you to show his lady flame. Acting as the catalyst for the destruction of the world he called home. He was willing to burn everything he knew if it meant the girl could have a future in a world that did not rot. Once the fire was lit and Ariandel was consumed, the girl began her work. But the pigment she needed, the blood of the Dark Soul, was located at the literal end of the world, in the Ringed City. Gael set out on a journey that would take him through the Dreckheap, a location where all the kingdoms of history had collapsed into a single pile of rubble. He left a message for the player, guiding you through the ruins and encouraging you to take leaps of faith. He was acting as a scout, a man who had already seen the path and was clearing it for the person he hoped would follow. He knew he was not a champion. He was an old slave who had survived through sheer stubbornness, and he understood that the task of retrieving the Dark Soul would likely destroy him. Gael reached the Ringed City and discovered the Pygmy Lords, the original keepers of the Dark Soul. But after 1,000 years of stagnation, their blood had dried up. It was no longer a liquid that could be used as paint. It was an inert, dry essence trapped within their shriveled bodies. Gael did the only thing he could do. He slaughtered the lords and began to consume them. He ate the lords and drank their dried blood, hoping that by taking the Dark Soul into his own body, his own blood would act as a vessel to rehydrate the pigment. He turned his own veins into a well for the Dark Soul. He knew that the power would corrupt him, and that he would never be able to return to the girl. But he did it anyway. He sacrificed his remaining humanity to become the paint for a world he would never see. When you finally reach Gael at the end of the game, the world has been reduced to a vast desert of ash. Every kingdom has been ground to dust. The sky is flat, a grey void. Gael has grown to a massive size, his body warped and broken by the power he consumed. He is a mindless beast, impaling the corpse of the Pygmy Lords on his sword and tossing them aside. When he sees you, he does not recognize a friend. He sees only another source of the Dark Soul. He demands your soul for his lady's painting. The fight with Gael is a reflection of the entire history of human struggle. In the first phase, he moves like an animal, leaping and crawling through the ash. He has lost his human posture, becoming a creature of pure instinct. In the second phase, he stands upright and begins using his crossbow and his miracles. This is a terrifying moment where his memories as a knight return to him. He fights with the calculated precision of a man who has lived through 1,000 wars. He uses the Way of White Corona and his crossbow, combined with the raw power of the Dark Soul that is now leaking out of a hole in his chest. He is a union of every force that ever shaped the world. In the final phase of the fight, the Dark Soul begins to erupt from his body. Every time he swings his sword, dark spirits are released, and lightning strikes the ground around him. He's no longer a man wielding a soul. He's a vessel that is being torn apart by the energy it contains. He's the ultimate slave, a man who outlasted the gods, only to be enslaved by the very essence of his own race. When you finally strike him down, you are not just winning a boss fight. You are granting a merciful end to the longest, most arduous life in history. In his death, his blood is finally filled with the Dark Soul, transformed into the pigment the painter needs. You take his blood back to the girl in the burning library of Ariandel. She thanks you and asks for your name, so she can name the new painting after you. If you refuse to give her your name, she decides to name the painting Ash. She promises that it will be a cold, dark, and very gentle place. This is the ultimate conclusion to the Dark Souls series. The world of the gods was built on fire and hierarchy, and it resulted in a cycle of endless suffering and rot. The world painted by the girl, built on the blood of a slave and the pigment of the Dark Soul, is intended to be a place for the forlorn, which is a home that does not require a throne or a sacrifice to stay alive. The tragedy of slave Knight Gael is that he was the architect of a future he was never allowed to inhabit. He spent his entire existence in servitude, first to the gods who hated him, and then to a mission that required his total self-destruction. He was a man who saw the beginning and the end, and he chose to spend his final moments becoming a tool for a child's dream. He was the only character in the series who actually achieved a goal that moved beyond the stagnation of the first flame. He didn't try to link the fire or usher in the Age of Dark. He tried to create something entirely new. Gael represents the true strength of humanity, the ability to endure. He was not a god, he was not a chosen hero, and he was not a king. He was a slave who refused to stop walking. He carried the weight of the Dark Soul until it broke his mind, and he did it so that the next generation would have a place where they could finally rest. As we leave the Desert of Ash and look back at the painting, we realize that Gael was the most important person in the world, because he was the only one who was willing to be forgotten. His blood is the color of the new world, and his silence is the foundation of its peace. The slave knight has finally finished his duty, and for the first time in history, he is allowed to stay dead. The painting remains a quiet, gentle sanctuary sitting in the middle of a burning ruin. It is the legacy of an old man with a red hood and a broken sword. It is a world without brands, without executioners, and without the fear of the dark. Gael may have failed to return to his niece, and he may have died as a hollowed beast. But in the stroke of a brush, he became immortal. He is the cold of the dark, and he is the gentleness that finally brought the world to a close. His story is a reminder that even at the end of all things, a single act of selfless love is enough to change the nature of existence. The fire is gone, the dark is here, and for the first time, it is not something to be feared. It is simply home. The condition of an unkindled is defined by a specific type of grief. It is the realization that you have already failed once, and the reward for that failure is to be dragged back into a world that no longer has a place for you. When a man rises from the grave as ash, he is forced to bear the weight of his own inadequacy. He was not strong enough to link the fire in his first life, and now he is expected to hunt down the legends who actually succeeded where he could not. This is the perspective of Hawkwood. He is the first person most travelers meet at Firelink Shrine, and he serves as a cold reminder of the futility of the mission. He does not offer encouragement or heroic tales. He offers only the truth of the crestfallen. To him, the unkindled are worthless creatures who cannot even die correctly. They are the leftovers tasked with forcing the Lords of Cinder back to their thrones, even though these lords are far more powerful than the Ash sent to retrieve them. Hawkwood was not always a lone survivor sitting on a stone staircase. Long before he became Ash, he was a member of the Undead Legion of Farron. The Abyss Watchers were a terrifying military force, a pack of warriors who shared the blood of the wolf and swore to contain the spread of the Abyss at any cost. They were not subtle. If a kingdom showed even a small sign of the dark, the Legion would bury that kingdom and everyone in it. To gain entry into this group was a matter of extreme ceremony and hardship. They were heroes to some and monsters to others, but they were united by a singular violent resolve. However, Hawkwood was a turncoat. He was a man who could not bear the psychological or physical weight of the Legion's duty. He deserted the ranks, leaving behind his brothers and sisters to face the dark alone. He was a man who feared his own mortality in a way the other Watchers did not. The evidence of Hawkwood's cowardice was visible in his equipment. The Abyss Watchers were known for a specific aggressive fighting style. They used a great sword in one hand and a jagged dagger in the other, relying on speed and constant movement to overwhelm their enemies. They did not use shields. To hold a shield was to admit a need for self-preservation, which went against the self-sacrificing nature of the wolf's blood. But Hawkwood clutched a shield close to his chest. He used a bastard sword and a piece of wood and iron to protect himself from the strikes of his enemies. He was a man who wanted to survive in a group that was prepared to die. This distinction made him an outcast among his own kind. He was Hawkwood the Craven, the man who could not live up to the standard of the wolf. When he eventually failed to link the fire and became unkindled, he was forced to know that his best effort was not enough to save the world or even himself. At Filing Shrine, Hawkwood's pessimism is directed at the very concept of lordship. He looks at the thrones of the Lords of Cinder and sees molding seats for true legends. He mocks the idea that an ashen failure could ever hope to convince these powerful beings to return. He specifically points to Aldrich, the Saint of the Deep, as an example of what lordship truly means in this era. He describes Aldrich not as a virtuous hero, but as a right and proper cleric who developed a habit of eating people until he turned into a mass of sludge. To Hawkwood, a fire does not care about virtue. It only cares about power. The gods made Aldrich a Lord of Cinder because he was strong enough to feed the flame, not because he was good. This realization that lordship is a sham is what keeps Hawkwood rooted to the staircase. If the greatest heroes in history were actually gluttonous monsters, then the entire mission to link the fire is a joke. The shift in Hawkwood's character begins when the player actually starts to succeed. When the Ashen One kills the Abyss Watchers, the very legion Hawkwood abandoned, it forces him to confront his own stagnation. He realizes that if the worthless ash can bring down the legends of the wolf, then perhaps the world is not as rigid as he believed. He leaves the shrine, but before he goes, he leaves the shield behind. He placed it at a gravestone outside the cathedral, a marker for a life he is no longer interested in leading. This is a pivotal moment of transformation. By discarding the shield, he is discarding his need for safety. He is no longer Hawkwood the Craven. He is a man looking for a purpose that exists outside the cycle of fire and ash. He begins to pursue the path of the dragon, a calling that seeks to transcend the limitations of life and death entirely. The path of the dragon is a pursuit of a different plane of existence. It is the hope of becoming something that does not need to link a fire or fear the dark. We see Hawkwood again in the Consumed King's Garden and at Archdragon Peak. He is no longer sitting and waiting for the world to end. He is fighting his way through toxic swamps and ancient ruins, seeking the relics of the Apostles. He is searching for the Dragon Stones, objects that allow an undead to shed their human skin and take on the form of the ancient eternal beings. He has found a mission that is his own, not one forced upon him by a firekeeper or a prophecy. He wants to be a true dragon, something that is rightfully his and not a gift from the gods. This search for transcendence is his last attempt to be special in a world that treated him as garbage. The final confrontation between the player and Hawkwood takes place in the mausoleum where his story began, the home of the Abyss Watchers. He sends a message through the blacksmith Andre, challenging the player to a duel. This is not a petty theft or a moment of madness. It is a formal challenge between two warriors who are seeking the same goal. Hawkwood stands in the center of the room, and for the first time, he is wielding the Farron Greatsword, the weapon of the legion he once fled. He has finally picked up the sword of his brothers, and he is using it without a shield to protect himself. He has found his courage at the very end of his life. He is prepared to kill or be killed to achieve the transformation he craves. He is no longer running from his fate. He is running toward it. When Hawkwood falls in battle, his final words are not filled with bitterness. He looks at the player and admits that they are more dragon than he is. He accepts his defeat with a clarity that he lacked at the start of the journey. He says that a deserter could hope for no better place to die than in the home of his legion, killed by a champion who proved to be his equal. He dies as the last remaining warrior of the Undead Legion, having finally found a purpose worth dying for. He was a man who was broken by the world, who spent his life in fear and cynicism, but who managed to find a moment of true heroism in his final hours. He proved that even a coward is capable of greatness if they are willing to stop running. The story of Hawkwood is a reminder that the crestfallen are often just people who are tired of being used. He saw through the lies of the gods and the cruelty of the cycle, and he chose to look for a third way out. While he never achieved the transcendence of the dragon, he achieved something more important. He reclaimed his own will. He stopped being a worthless ash and became a warrior again. He's a tragic figure, but his tragedy is one of redemption. He died in the mausoleum of his brothers, no longer a turncoat, but a knight who fought until the very end. The staircase at Firelink Shrine remains empty, but the memory of the man who sat there remains a testament to the fact that even the most broken soul can find a reason to stand up. Hawkwood's presence at the grave outside Firelink suggests a deeper connection to the fallen. It is possible the grave belonged to a comrade, or perhaps it was a symbolic grave for his own lost honor. When he prayed there, he was mourning the person he used to be. The fact that he leaves his shield there shows he was finally ready to let go of that grief. In the world of Dark Souls 3, where everything is collapsing and folding in on itself, Hawkwood's journey to Archdragon Peak represents a rare attempt at vertical movement, a climb towards something higher than the ash. He didn't want to sit on a throne. He wanted to fly above them. And while he failed to reach the peak, he died reaching for it, which is the only kind of success an unkindled can ever truly hope for. The legacy of the Undead Legion is a bloody one, but through Hawkwood, we see the human cost of that legacy. It was not about fighting the Abyss. It was about the men who were destroyed by the duty. Hawkwood was the one who survived long enough to tell us how much it hurt. His cynicism was a shield for his heart, just as the physical shield was a defense for his body. When he let go of both, he became vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, he found his strength. He is the last Watcher, the one who stayed behind to see the end of the world and decided to go out on his own terms. His death is a quiet conclusion to a loud and violent history a final toast to a man who was once a coward and died a knight. To look at the cinders of the lords is to see the power of the past, but to look at the remains of Hawkwood is to see the struggle of the present. He's the most relatable character in the game because he reflects the player's own moments of doubt. Every time we die and consider giving up, we are Hawkwood. Every time we push forward despite the odds, we are the man he eventually became. He is a mirror for the ashen failures who are trying to make sense of a world that has already moved on. As the moon sets in Irithyll and the fire fades in Lothric, the story of the deserter remains a cold, hard fact. He was a man who couldn't die right, so he decided to live for something better. And in the end, that was enough. The true story of Gundyr begins in the untended graves, a version of the shrine that exists in a state of permanent eclipse. In this lightless reflection of the world, we find champion Gundyr in his prime. He was an ancient warrior charged with the most significant duty, the linking of the first flame. He was given a massive iron halberd, a weapon forged to be unbreakable, signaling that his service was intended to be eternal. He was not meant to be a minor figure in history. He was supposed to be the chosen of his era. But when Gundyr finally arrived at the shrine to fulfill his destiny, the festivities he expected were gone. He found a shrine without a fire and a bell that refused to toll. He was late. The specific tragedy of his arrival is emphasized by the Estus Ring, which tells us of an ancient firekeeper who never met her champion. Their intended meeting became a tragic farce, a story that the masses of Lothric eventually turned into a joke. He was a hero who missed his cue, and the world mocked him for it. The question of who Gundyr was before he became the belated champion leads directly to the royal family of Lothric. His armor is the primary clue. The cast iron set is described as being modeled after a former king, a detail that has led many to believe he was a part of the royal bloodline, perhaps even the eldest son of King Osiris. The design of his gear mirrors the aesthetic of the Lothric royalty. The deep royal blue cloths, the intricate golden trim, and the crowns integrated into the helmet designs. If Gundyr was indeed a prince, his journey to the shrine was a state-sponsored mission. The Lothric bloodline was obsessed with producing a worthy heir to the fire, resorting to unspeakable means to ensure the flame remained lit. They filled Gundyr's head with delusions of grandeur, telling him that he was the one true champion who would save the world. But the reality was far more cynical. The royal family may have known all along that he was only a pawn, a placeholder meant to protect the gate until a truer champion arrived. The farce was not just that Gundyr arrived late. It was that his entire purpose was a pretense. He believed he was a savior, but he was treated as a scabbard. This betrayal is confirmed by the prisoner's chain, a piece of steel used to restrain him after his failure. The item description notes that a prisoner is often someone who has staked everything on a belief, a trait most apparent in the greatest of champions. Gundyr's belief was the life fed to him by his own family. They preempted his heroic sacrifice by ensuring he would never actually reach the flame. In the untended graves, he is bested by an unknown warrior implied to be the player traveling through time. This defeat was likely the final stage of his transition. Weakened and broken, he was restrained and impaled by the coiled sword. He was transformed into an indestructible golem, a ritual test of strength, for those who would follow him. He was cursed to stay in that arena for centuries, kneeling in the dirt, waiting for someone to pull the sword out and end his long silent watch. The transition from champion to Ludex is the transition from a person to a tool. For ages, Gundyr sat in the cemetery of ash, the iron of the coiled sword burning into his chest. He was no longer a man with ambition. He was the goalkeeper for a cycle that was already collapsing. Because he was an abyssal creature, his body eventually became a host for the pus of man. This is the oily black corruption that bursts from his shoulder during the initial fight. It is a manifestation of raging humanity that has gone stagnant and wild. It is a cruel irony that a man who was supposed to be the champion of the light became a vessel for the deepest dark. By the time the player pulls the sword from his chest, Gundyr is basically a conscious being. He is an instinctual force performing a duty of judgment that was written for him by the people who betrayed him. The presence of the Queen of Lothric in this story adds another layer of quiet guilt. Behind the shrine, in the dark version of the graves, we find the remains of a queen who cared for the rootless warriors. It is suggested that she visited this dark, visitorless grave out of shame or remorse for the son she helped condemn. She left behind the hidden blessing and other relics, small gestures of comfort for a soul that was sacrificed for a flame that would never stay lit. The entire kingdom of Lothric was built on these kinds of sacrifices. Family members turned into kindling, or judges to keep the Age of Fire alive for just a few more years. Gundyr was the first and perhaps the most tragic of these sacrifices, as he was the only one who believed the lies the most sincerely. When you finally defeat Ludex Gundyr at the start of the game, you are granting a merciful end to a sentence that has lasted for centuries. He falls, dissolving into ash, and the coiled sword is left in your hands. You inherit his duty, but you do not have to inherit his chains. He was the belated champion who arrived at an empty shrine, only to be turned into the very thing he sought to protect. He was a king who became a scabbard, a warrior who became a judge, and a son who became a farce. In the grand, crumbling history of Dark Souls 3, Gundyr remains the definitive example of how the cycle of fire consumes everything it touches, starting with the people who believe in it the most. The physical arena where Gundyr waits is a masterclass in environmental storytelling. It is an amphitheater complete with stands for spectators. This suggests that at one point, the Judgment of the Ash was a public spectacle, a ritual that the people of Lothric would watch as if it were a sport. They watched their champion act as a gatekeeper, laughing at the face they had created. He was a prisoner in a theater of his own failure. Every time a new one kindled rose and failed to beat him, Gundyr's purpose was validated in the most painful way possible. He was the bar that no one could clear, yet he was the bar that was never supposed to exist. His halberd, which was said to never crumble, is the only part of him that remains truly intact. A cold piece of cast iron that outlasted the man who held it. The pus of man that erupts from him is particularly significant because it represents the dark that the royal family feared so much. They tried to use Gundyr to protect the fire, but they ended up creating a vessel for the abyss. When humanity has no outlet and no purpose, it turned into that writhing black mass. Gundyr had his purpose stripped away when he found the shrine empty, and in that vacuum of meaning, the dark took over. He was a man holding onto a coiled sword of fire while his own soul was being eaten by the sludge of the deep. It is a visual representation of the stalemate that defines the end of the world. In the end, the tragedy of Gundyr is the tragedy of lordship itself. He was mighty enough to be a lord, but he lacked the virtue, or perhaps the timing, to actually sit the throne. He was a champion of the world that didn't want to be saved by him. As the player moves past his corpse and into the filing shrine, they are stepping over the remains of the old world's greatest hope. He was the first judge, the one who determined who was worthy to carry the flame, yet he was never allowed to touch it himself. The kingdom of Lothric is defined by violent verticality, but beneath its foundations lies a massive sheer cliff known as the High Wall, which appeared with a suddenness that permanently altered the landscape. This barrier functioned as a separation between the survivors of the royal line and the common people. While the nobles retreated to the safety of their high chambers, the rest of humanity was abandoned to the rotting settlement at the base of the mountain. In the final days of the world, geography became the ultimate enforcer of class. The royalty lived in the light of the upper peaks, leaving the masses to hollow in the damp shadows below. Greirat was a product of his lower world. He was a man who spent his life in the mud of the settlement, looking up at the kingdom that viewed his existence as a minor nuisance to be stepped over or ignored. Greirat's identity was stripped from him long before the player ever turned the key to his cell. He wears a hood made of coarse grey fabric, the kind of head covering issued to thralls and labourers. It was designed to hide the face, to turn a person into a generic tool of the state. Sometimes, it was used as a mark of shame for criminals, a way to tell the world that the wearer had no honor left to defend. Greirat wore this hood into the dungeons of the High Wall, where he was thrown for a crime we can only guess at. He likely knew the castle better than the knights who patrolled it, having spent years scurrying through its hidden passages and supply tunnels. When the bell tolled and the unkindled rose from their graves, Greirat was sitting in the dark, listening to the sound of a world that was finally giving up on itself. When the player finds him, he's not a man looking for a heroic escape. He's a pragmatic thief who recognizes a shift in the wind. He looks at the Ashen One and sees a person with a purpose, something he hasn't encountered in a very long time. He makes a deal, freedom in exchange for service. But his first request is not for gold or a weapon to defend himself. He asks the player to find an old woman named Loretta in the settlement at the base of the wall. He gives the player a blue tearstone ring, a piece of jewelry that glows with a dim, melancholy light. These stones are said to sense the approach of death, providing a final moment of protection for those who have nothing left. Greirat knew Loretta was in danger, or perhaps he knew she was already gone. And the ring was his way of saying goodbye to the only person who remembered his name before he was just a number in a cell. The Undead Settlement is a visceral record of how the poor suffer when the gods stop caring. It is a town filled with the stench of rot and the sound of hollows performing meaningless tasks. The residents are not living, they are simply waiting to be processed. They are stuffed into bags hung from trees and tossed into pits to be burned as waste. It is a place where the concept of home has been replaced by the concept of disposal. When the player finds Loretta, she is nothing more than a corpse hanging from a balcony, clutching a scrap of bone. There is no dignity in her death, and there was likely very little in her life. Returning to Greirat with this news is the moment his character truly shifts. He tries to play it off as a relief, a minor detail in a long life of disappointments. But the way he curls into a ball at the base of the shrine tells a different story. The thief who claimed to have more wits than royalty was finally forced to face the fact that all the cleverness couldn't save the one thing that mattered to him. After a period of quiet grief, Greirat finds a new reason to exist. He decides that since he is already a petty rat, he might as well be useful to the one person who showed him mercy. He asks to go on a pillaging mission to the settlement. This is a profound admission. He is going back to his home to scavenge the remains of his own neighbors. He's admitting that the world he came from is dead, and the only thing that has value now is the mission of the Unkindled. He brings back weapons and items that the poor had no use for anymore, turning the scraps of a dying town into the tools for a new lord. He does this with a humble, almost desperate loyalty. He tells the player to stay safe, not because he cares about the fire, but because if the player dies, Greirat's last remaining purpose dies with them. He is a man who is terrified of being alone in the dark again. The mission to Irithyll is where Greirat's path crosses with the broader legends of the world. Irithyll is a city of moon-worshipping nobles, a place of silver spires and freezing cold. To a thief from the muck, it is a treasure hoard. To a person with common sense, it is a death trap. Sulyvahn City is guarded by knights who have lost their minds and beasts that were once people. When Greirat asks to go there, he is testing his luck against the greatest powers left in the world. This is also where we see that Greirat has earned the respect of an unlikely peer. Unbreakable Patches, a man known for his total lack of empathy and his hatred for clerics, expresses a genuine concern for the thief. He calls him a slinking rodent, but he acknowledges a debt. Greirat had helped Patches in the past, and even a man as cynical as Patches can recognize the value of a friend in a world where friends are extinct. If Greirat is saved in Irithyll, it is often by the intervention of Sigurd of Katarina, or Patches disguised as the Onion Knight. It is a strange overlapping moment of protection. A high-ranking knight and a legendary trickster both conspire to keep a petty thief alive. When Greirat returns, he is emboldened. He has survived the City of the Gods and brought back treasures that shouldn't exist. But this success creates a dangerous momentum. He begins to see himself as more than just a rat. He starts to believe that he can achieve something honorable, something that the nobles in their high castle could never understand. He looks at Lothric Castle, the source of all his misery, and the place where his life as a slave began, and he decides he has to go back. The final climb up the wall is Greirat's attempt at a masterpiece. He knows that Lothric Castle is a place where no one returns from. He knows that the knights there are the most elite killers the kingdom has left. He tells the player that he doesn't want to die like a petty rat in a corner. He wants his death to mean something. This is his version of linking the fire. He's offering his life to find the one item, the one weapon, or the one scrap of treasure that might give the player an edge against the princes. He's a man who has lived a life of theft and shame, and he's trying to trade his final breath for a moment of dignity. He sets off for the castle with a grim, quiet resolve, knowing that the wits he once bragged about won't be enough this time. Greirat's journey ends on the rooftops of the Grand Archives. He is found amongst the Corvians and the gargoyles, his body tucked away in a corner where he is finally cornered. He didn't die in a prison cell, and he didn't die as a nameless slave. He died as a thief in the heart of the kingdom that tried to crush him. He died in the one place where the nobles thought they were safe. When the player finds his ashes, they carry more than just the records of his wares. They carry the weight of a man who refused to be defined by the wall that was built to keep him down. He lived as a rodent because that was the role the world gave him, but he died as a martyr for a friend. The tragedy of Greirat is that he was a better man than the royalty he mocked. While the princes sat in their chambers and watched the world burn, Greirat was out in the cold, risking his life to help someone else. He didn't have a lord soul, and he wasn't a champion of prophecy, but he had a sense of loyalty that the gods had forgotten eons ago. He was the little man who stood his ground when the legends fled their thrones. Bringing his ashes to the shrine handmaid is a bitter conclusion. She takes his items and puts them on a shelf, and the world continues to fade. But for a brief moment, there was a thief in Lothric who proved that even in a world of absolutes, the gap between a slave and a king is only as wide as the heart of the person standing between them. The divide between the nobles and the hollows remained until the very end, but Greirat managed to leap across it. He climbed the wall that was meant to be impassable. He entered the castle that was meant to be a fortress. He died in the archives where all the knowledge of the world was kept, and the only thing he left behind was a pile of ash and a promise kept. He was Greirat of the Undead Settlement, a petty thief who found a way to be a hero in a world that had no room for them. As the fire fades and the dark takes over, his story is a reminder that the things we treasure aren't the gold or the swords, but the people who are willing to go into the dark for us. To talk about Greirat is to talk about the future of the Kingdom of Lothric. They built their walls to protect their fire, but they ended up creating a world where the only people worth saving were the ones they locked in cages. They tried to shame the thieves and the slaves, but in the end, it was a thief and a slave who showed more courage than any Knight of the Sun. Greirat sat on the stairs of the shrine and grieved for a woman he couldn't save. And then he stood up and tried to save the world instead. He was a petty rat who became a giant. And his story is the true record of what it means to be human in a world that is losing its soul. The blue tearstone ring that Greirat once held is a fitting symbol for his life. It is a jewel that only shines when things are at their worst. Greirat didn't shine when he was safe or successful. He shone when he was in the most danger. He was at his best when he was facing death for the sake of someone else. He was a man of the shadows who found his own light, and he did it without the help of the gods or the flame. He was the last honest man in a kingdom of liars, and he died with his hood on, staring at the sky he was never supposed to reach. Farewell, Greirat, and may you find a settlement in the next world where there are no walls and no cages. The silence that follows his departure from Thylling Shrine is one of the heaviest moments in the journey. The empty spot on the stairs is a reminder that the world is getting smaller. One by one, the people we care about disappear into the dark, and we are left to finish the mission alone. Greirat knew this would happen. He knew that he was just a footnote in the story of the Ashen One. but he was a footnote that mattered. He was the one who provided the arrows, the knives, and the hope when everything else was falling apart. He was a petty thief, but he had more honor in his pinky finger than the lords had in their entire souls. And that, in the end, is the only disparity that truly matters. Ultimately, Greirat's story is an answer to the question of what an undead does with their unnatural existence. He didn't look for a throne or a god to serve. He looked for a friend. He found purpose in the simple act of being useful. He realized that even if he couldn't save the world, he could save a moment for someone else. He climbed the wall, not for the view, but to see if there was anything left that was worth bringing back. He lived as a slave and died as a free man, because he chose his own end. He was a champion of the small things, and his failure to survive the castle was his greatest victory as a human being. The petty rat is gone, and the world is a little bit darker for it. To understand the children of Gwyn is to understand the lineage defined by utility. Every child born to the Lord of Sunlight was shaped as a tool to serve a specific function within his fading empire. Guinevere was the maternal face of the kingdom, a symbol of fertility and comfort intended to soothe a population exhausted by the brutal wars of the past. Gwyndolin was the master of shadows and illusion, tasked with maintaining a facade of dying light long after the true sun had begun to set. Filianor, the youngest, was the ultimate seal, a sleeping princess whose slumber held the very end of the world at bay. Yet before all of these, there was the firstborn. He was the original god of war, a figure so central to the foundation of the Age of Fire that his eventual erasure from history remains the most significant act of divine spite in the series. The war for disparity was the defining event of existence. Before the flame, the world was a grey, unmoving expanse ruled by everlasting dragons. There was no life or death, only the stone-like permanence of the scales. When the lords claimed their souls from the heat of the fire, they introduced the concept of the end to a race that had never known it. Gwyn's firstborn was divinely conceived to be the vanguard of this transition. He inherited the lightning of his father, but he also possessed an innate violent predisposition for combat. While his sisters were symbols of peace or secrets, he was the embodiment of the sun's aggressive power. He did not just fight the dragons. He was built to dismantle them. The military innovation of the firstborn changed the nature of the war. He wielded a sword spear, a massive, ingenious weapon that combined the reach of a polearm with the weight of a blade. It was designed to leverage the user's own body weight, allowing the tip to be driven deep into the near-impervious hide of a dragon. This weapon was the ancestor of the cross spear, the signature armament of the dragon slayers. His first knight was Ornstein, a warrior whose legendary status was merely a reflection of the firstborn's influence. Alongside them stood Havel the Rock, a man who encased himself in stone and wielded a dragon's tooth. Together, these three formed a trio of slayers who moved across the grey crags like a storm, turning the immortal dragons into corpses. They were the heroes of an age that believed its glory would be eternal. However, the victory in the war for disparity brought an uncomfortable truth. Disparity, by its very definition, requires a balance of opposites. If the dragons were completely erased, the balance that the fire created would be destroyed. Gwyn's firstborn was the first to realize that the total annihilation of his enemies was a rejection of the natural order. While Gwyn became obsessed with preventing the dark and keeping his Age of Fire alive at any cost, his son began to see the dragons differently. He saw them not as monsters to be purged, but as a part of the world that deserved to exist. This was not a sudden betrayal, but a slow realization that his father's version of righteousness was actually a form of divine tyranny. The God of War eventually made the unthinkable choice to ally himself with the remains of the dragon race. He chose arms and respect over blood and loyalty. Gwyn, a man whose pride was as vast as his power, responded with a level of cruelty that surpassed even his war on the dragons. He did not just exile his son, he attempted to murder his memory. He stripped the firstborn of his deific status and his royal name. He ordered his statues smashed and his name expunged from every record. The God of War became the Nameless King, a ghost in his own father's kingdom. Every altar dedicated to him was broken, and his legacy was replaced with a silence that lasted for thousands of years. Gwyn wanted the world to believe his firstborn had never existed at all. Despite this divine erasure, faith has a way of persisting in the cracks of history. Even as the gods abandoned the firstborn, his knights did not. Ornstein, the captain of Gwyn's 4 knights, was left behind in Anor Londo to guard a cathedral that was already empty. He was tasked with protecting an illusion of Guinevere, partnered with the cannibalistic executioner, Smo. For a warrior who had been fought alongside a god, this was a humiliating and hollow role. As the other knights of Gwyn faded or lost their minds, Ornstein eventually realized that his true oath was not to the dead king in the kiln, but to the exiled prince he had served in the war. He abandoned his post in the ruined city of the gods to search for the Nameless King. Smo remained at his post alone, a glutton who eventually became the last guardian of a dead era. It is a sharp irony that the most noble dragon slayer was the first to leave, while the most reviled executioner was the one who stayed until the end. Ornstein's path took him across many lands, and his influence can be seen in the cultures that rose in the wake of Anor Londo. In Ferosa, the Lion Knights worshipped a god of war who blessed their armor, and their helmets depicted a knight in a desperate struggle against a dragon. In the ruins of Heidi, others tried to mimic the style, though they were only shadows of the original. These fragments of history suggest that while the firstborn's name was gone, his impact on the art of war was impossible to erase. The world was changing, and the lines between dragon and hunter began to blur. The Knights of Lothric, who started their history as slayers of wyverns, eventually learned to tame them. They fought at the sight of these creatures they once hated, adopting their lightning and their strength. The evolution mirrored the path of the Nameless King himself. He had settled on Archdragon Peak, a hidden stronghold above the clouds where dragons and their kin could live in peace. He had tamed a storm drake, a massive creature that became his constant companion in battle. They were no longer master and beast, but a single unit of war. They waited in the stillness of the peak, watching as Gwyn's Age of Fire slowly turned into a pile of cold ash. Archdragon Peak is a place of absolute patience. Dragons have an abundance of time, and they were content to wait out the gods. The Nameless King sat on his throne, a lord of a race he was born to destroy, surrounded by those who sought to transcend their human forms and become dragons themselves. He was a knight of the wretches and the imperfect, the mutated descendants of the ancient ones who had adapted to a hostile world. He had sacrificed his family, his name, and his throne to uphold a truth that his father could not accept. That war should be fought for what one believes in, not simply to erase the opposition. The arrival of the Ashen One at Archdragon Peak is the final collision of these two worldviews. The player is driven by a desire to claim the strength of a god and the souls of the Ancient Ones. By ringing the bell and challenging the Nameless King, the player is forcing a conclusion to a story that began at the dawn of time. The fight is not a battle of good against evil, but a meeting of two different types of persistence. The Nameless King fights with a wary clinical efficiency. His movements, a reminder of why he was once the most feared warrior in the Pantheon. He absorbs the soul of his Stormdrake when it falls, not out of hunger, but as a final act of camaraderie, carrying his partner's strength into the final moments of the conflict. When the Nameless King is finally defeated, he does not leave behind a grand speech or a plea for mercy. He leaves only his soul and the silence of the peak. He was a god who chose to be a man, a king who chose to be an exile, and a son who chose to be a traitor. His erasure was Gwyn's greatest failure, for it proved that even a god of sunlight cannot stop the truth from remaining in the world. He was the firstborn, the god of war, the only member of the royal family who had the courage to look at the fire and realize it was not the only thing worth protecting. The story of the Nameless King is a testament to the idea that heritage is not a cage. He was born for a purpose, but he chose a destiny. He took the lightning of the sun and used it to protect the shadows. As the player leaves the peak with the dragon's strength in their hands, they are carrying the legacy of a man who refused to be a pawn in his father's game. The Age of Fire ends not with a bang, but with a quiet realization that the things we were told to hate were often the only things that stayed true to their nature. The Nameless King may have lost his name, but he found a peace that the rest of his family would never know, sitting above the clouds, waiting for the wind to finally blow the ash away. The tragedy of Gwyn's lineage is that they were all trapped by their father's fear. Guinevere lived as an illusion, Gwyndolin lived as a secret, and Filianor lived as a sacrifice. Only the firstborn was willing to be hated to be free. He was the god of war who realized that the greatest victory is not the destruction of your enemy, but the ability to walk away from a throne that is built on lies. He is the true Lord of Sunlight because he understood that the sun eventually has to set. In the ruins of the world, where names and titles have lost their meaning, the Nameless King stands as the only figure who truly outlasted the cycle by simply refusing to be a part of it. To look at the Nameless King is to see the physical cost of his choice. His skin is ashen and grey, his hair a wild silver mane that catches the wind of the peak. He does not look like a god. He looks like the world itself is old, weathered, and unyielding. He is the ultimate dragon slayer, because he is the only one who understood what they were. He didn't just kill them, he understood them. And in that understanding, he found a strength that Gwyn could never touch. He is the firstborn, the forgotten, and the final judge of a war that should have ended a long time ago. As we place his soul in our pockets and walk away, we are the only ones left who remember that once there was a son of the sun who chose the storm instead. The profaned flame, the abyss, and the rot are all forces that sought to end Gwyn's world. But the Nameless King was the only one who sought to transcend it. He didn't want to burn the world down or let it rot. He wanted to live in the grey that existed before the fire. He was a man of the beginning who found his home in the end. His story is the anchor for the entire series, a reminder that even in a world of predetermined cycles, there is always the option to say no and walk into the clouds. The war for disparity was won, but the war for the soul was only won by the king who had no name left to give. But there is a reason these stories stay under our skin long after the credits roll. We wouldn't care about the tragedy of the Nameless King if his spear clipped through walls, and we wouldn't mourn Yhorm if his fight felt like a glitchy chore. The emotional weight of these characters is held together by the frames of the animation. In this world, the lore is the soul, but the mechanics are the heartbeat. And while we spent our time investigating the why behind these broken legends, it's time to address the how. Step into the dark with me as we analyze and see why the bosses in Dark Souls 3 are still mechanically the best.